and enabled Turkish state terror enacted on the Kurds in Turkey. Clearly, it's not on the same mass scale. It's not for wearing, here, it's not for wearing Kurdish colours or singing a Kurdish song. They're not directly comparable regimes, nor should they be. But still, I argue they're structured in the same logic and the same structure of trying to disrupt or annihilate any social relationship to an idea that the Kurdish liberation struggle is legitimate. Now, it's a very obvious thing to say, and it's been said many times by others before, but it must be said again that the listing of the PKK is done by Western states at Turkey's behest and for their foreign policy interests in happy, but also the hegemonic consensus at play to annihilate people's freedom struggles and democracy. Determination, which is seen as sort of threatening to the nation state. So this is why today we see Kurds prosecuted as not guilty for holding the PKK flag as terrorist offenders, and at present around 9 more Kurds currently awaiting trial for serious offences in supporting the PKK. It's why in Germany, the most repressive of Turkish allies, where there are tens of hundreds of Kurds, leadership in Europe listed by the US's extraterritorial foreign terrorist list, their accounts frozen and their movements limited. This is why in Australia, Kurds too have been criminalised and live in the shadow of explicit state surveillance by ASIO, the AFP, and police, especially since the 2005 listing, including state surveillance at meetings, at rallies. And these are matters that we, several of our friends who are in the audience, we have every 3 years attend Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, because it used to be that the listing used to sunset and you had an opportunity to kind of argue why they should be delisted. And these experiences would be raised by Kurdish community members, and I would raise the results of my research to Parliament, but falling on absolute deaf ears. And to sort of give some more examples, over the years, police in this country routinely advised protesters holding portraits of Mr. Öcalan that it was illegal to do so and that there may be consequences. Yeah. But unlike many other jurisdictions, it was not unlawful at that time to display the so-called insignia of banned organisations in Australia. But, and I think this is less well known, recent laws, Commonwealth laws that made the display of Nazi paraphernalia unlawful, also quietly made it unlawful to also display the insignia of listed terrorist organisations. So, I want to acknowledge a low point for the Kurdish community was in 2010, when I think around 17 Kurdish residences across New South Wales and Victoria, including Kurdish community organisations, were raided by the authorities to search and enter warrants. And the reported purpose of the raids, was said to relate to funding offences, and absolutely not a single person was charged because there is nothing there. So regardless of whether charges are laid against individuals, interventions by the police or ASIO function as a form of harassment and criminalisation that stigmatises and labels the entire Kurdish community, constructing, a suspect community. So the social harms of terrorist labelling include social exclusion, interpersonal racism, and I know that the Kurdish community have received death threats over the years. It was terrible when the Kurdish community's building was subject to several violent attacks by unknown assailants before the building, as it was then, burnt down in April 2011. A really traumatic time for the community. I don't think it's a stretch to say this is part of the paradigm and the continuum of the results of
what is a form of state terror that comes with the listing of the PKK. It's a systemic effect of terrorist labelling rather than unrelated actions by individual extremists, far-right people, or as the Australian state tries to minimise the effects as an unfortunate criminal event. And then, of course, we're hearing of many Australian Kurds who visit Turkey on holiday and find themselves detained and charged with terrorism offences, sometimes triggered for social media posts as innocuous as showing Kurdish children wearing traditional colours, or because they happen to criticise the human rights record of the regime. And I know community members here who have directly experienced that horror themselves or have family or friends happen to, including, I know it's been reported in the media, very respected Kurdish community member, Kidman Aslan, who was charged with outlandish and baseless offences around the PKK and detained for around 5 months in Turkey and is still there, and while released from prison, isn't able to leave and is subject to criminal proceedings. So Australia's listing of the PKK only legitimates such oppressive actions. Whilst so far the harassment in Australia has been largely directed to so-called disruption operations, and that is their official name, rather than mass prosecutions that we see in Germany, obviously it relates to the population and the size of the Kurdish community. The prosecution of Kurdish Australian journalist Renas Lelikan in 2019 was a significant trauma for the community. And as I speak as someone who was on the legal team and supporting that case. So Renas was accompanying the PKK as a writer, as a journalist, chronicling the struggle and its history, writing articles for Kurdish media and not as a combatant. Yet on flimsy evidence, he faced a 5-week trial for foreign fighting. Thankfully, his prosecution resulted in a hung jury and his membership offence resulted in a community service order. But what's striking is that this was a political show trial. It drew on Turkish intelligence. I've got 3 minutes and I have a lot more I want to say, but I wanted to talk about, in this context, I think understanding and discussing the politics of the Kurdish freedom movement is crucial, and the central role of Öcalan's ideas and experimentation around democratic autonomy and confederalism is central. So hopefully I have time to very briefly introduce my understanding of democratic autonomy and democratic confederalism from, reading Abdullah Öcalan's writings, which I encourage you to do, and the work of Kurdish scholar activists, and I encourage you to read their work, like Dila Dirik, Taban Ganisa, and the important scholarship of academics like Yust Yongbadan, Ahmet Akaya, and Jeff Miley, and others. So as has been discussed, women's liberation, there were folks talking about such a driving force of the PKK's ideology is so central to Öcalan's critique of the state form as securing women's, oppression. Really, that ideology in his writing came from his dialogue with Kurdish women across the movement that particularly facilitated that shift to democratic autonomy and confederalism. I think many people not connected to the movement misunderstand what the struggle was seeking, equating self-determination with secession and independent Kurdish state. Certainly, there was a process of critique and self-critique in the 2000s that resulted in transforming the ideology and political organisation of the PKK on the basis of self-determination as a stateless society. And reflecting on how other national liberation movements who gained statehood did not deliver emancipatory societies, Öcalan came to see the nation state as a centre of assimilation and homogenisation. So the PKK's new understanding of self-determination from the 2000s onwards revolved around democratic autonomy, referring to a regrounding the political status of the people on the basis of self-government rather than people's relations with the state. And it refers to practices in which people produce and reproduce the necessary and desired conditions for living through direct engagement with one another. And so that's institutionalised the democratic federalism, which aims at strengthening local administrative capacities, organised in the form of councils at the level of villages, urban neighbourhood, district, city, and region. So I know I've run out of time. We can talk more about it in discussion if we have time. But I guess I think that it's really important in this country to recognise and defend, learn more, do the reading about practices of radical democracy that the Kurds, have been experimenting with for some time as a form of resistance and protection from continued oppression. But also these are concepts that are of benefit to all people in the region and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vicky. Apologies if we had to really abide by the timing. If we don't, we're going to miss out on a lot of other stuff. But I'm going to open the floor, Vicky, if that's okay with you, for 1 or 2 questions for Vicky, if you have anything to ask. Yes.
Thank you very much. One of the questions is, as we go through to the laws, everything about Kurds has no legal basis. Every agreement has no legal basis because no Kurdish represented from the beginning. But looking at everything, some of the countries have made a decision to list the Kurdistan freedom to is based on certain political gain or geopolitical something. The country like Australia is a democratic country. The Kurds, Kurdistan freedom and having contribution so much to civilization. And I must say, there's still 35 jihadist members in Australia. You notice there's so many Kurdish people dying to protect that, and still in the Kurdistan have not intervened or done because of this list. So it's very unfortunate, but the question I have, such an organization, such a liberal society, such a contribution to humanity, what solid gain? Because I have to use the word this is on the list of periods. So I'm very interested for what is for product gain in such a distant geopolitical. There is no question to say you're going to war or you're going to east. So this is a question.
Look, I think there's lots of ways to answer that question, but I think the other speakers were talking this morning around, Turkey being a NATO member and Australia really not wanting to ruffle the relationship. I think that's the simplistic, easy answer. And unfortunately, the way that our political system works in terms of electoral politics, it's incredibly around, what's going to help you stay in power and in power. And it is, we were talking before about, Kurds minority status in Australia, seen as, it's easy to kind of overlook and not ruffle the relationship with Turkey. I think that's what it is. But it is part of the global regime of, there's a whole set of financial implications. The FATF has really complex transnational arrangement around if you don't sign on to certain requirements under the UN Security Council, you lose your credit rating. So there are things like that in terms of international political economy, which is also a factor.
Fantastic. Thank you. I don't want you to go, but that's that is unfortunately the reality. We have got one more question, Vicky, if that's okay. You're more than welcome to stay there if you like. Havan Mahmood, I think you need to come and use the microphone.
Thanks everyone. I just want to give a couple of concrete examples how Kurds speak with my state or crime against Kurds not often shared outside. When in Turkey, Iran, and Syria, commit any crime against Kurds, no one charged. The same here, since early 2000 to 2012, between 2012, many times our center attacks, and a couple of times it was accident attacks. And in 2010, they succeeded to burn down our association. There was an unchecked down our association. There was an attack on our registration. There was a very kill comments about Kurds team also that issue. And many times you complain, sometimes you go to the station, and we didn't question more than, and you feel we always felt reality. And even when our birds on there was footage, and people coming and throwing petrol bombs, and we never been informed what's the first, what's second. Every time we ask, the police ask one question, then the answer. And no one in our country will be charged with committing any crime against girls and Kurdish populations. And the criminalization of Kurds comes to the other thing I want to say, maybe about speaking, do we have anything right here? Once I remember when we went to Canada to join in front of the joint committee, try to somehow defend security of terrorist organization. I remember one of the member of parliament, at the end, the HC said, he said that, okay, we can understand it, but Turkey is a sovereign country, recognized by the UN, and your organization, any organization having arms struggle against sovereign country, for us, it's a terrorist organization. Then that's mean minority people who press their arms, they don't have any rights. And also, as you mentioned, still, not only children, but other members of the revolution, they can come back. When we approach our foreign officials, they can't, basically they don't help us. They can't help us, they say, oh, they are US citizens. I wonder if, as Australian citizens, those people, do they have any rights? Or when they go to Turkey, they can be oppressed anyway, they can be jailed anyway. It's really Australian law, can't do anything. Or because Kurdish infection, and not recognized, doesn't matter whether Kurdish been killed or oppressed or persecuted in Australia or in Turkey, saying this is one international process against Kurds.
Thank you, Havan Mahmood. I think we need to give time to Vicky. A lot of questions and observations. Thank you.
Look, I think you've said it all, Mahmood, so beautifully, and all I can do is go, yeah, I agree, and it's a travesty. And in terms of Kurdish Australians trapped in Turkey, the government needs to be doing more than they are. And generally, in relation to the Kurds, like, we can't appeal to the state because, we need to build understanding amongst the kind of, the community and the people around who the Kurds are, precisely what this conference is doing, to kind of build kind of more awareness and build pressure and advocacy because we're small at the moment, unfortunately, in terms of the numbers of people who are willing to speak up for the Kurds. Unless we do that, the balance of power is difficult to do. But as I said before, it's like we have to keep on going and keep fighting, and it's that struggle, in this country as well to agitate, to contact politicians, to use the media to kick up a fuss.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was wonderful. If I start actually sharing my observations, you're going to be here for the next 2 days. I'm holding on from sharing my observations. So trust me, I've got a lot of questions, but I'm holding on to them as well. If you do have other questions, you're more than welcome to write them down, pass them on to the speakers, and we'll get your contact details and bring it back to you later. Next up, we have another amazing speaker today. Kostas. How do you say the last name again? Latif. I'm not confident that we're going to have Kostas is going to take a with your biography, very short one, but not to say it's short. It's lengthy, but not short. Kostas is an associate professor in international relations at the university. His area of expertise in the region and track record for publications and research work across a number of years that span from Europe to Southeast Asia, and he's with us today to present his speech and lecture. He please welcome us.
Okay. Right. Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay, fantastic. Hello, everyone. Glad to be with you today. Like Vicky, and I'm from Vicky, I'm taking a couple of cues. The one is about inheritance. So myself, I'm the child of Greek refugees who became refugees because of Lausanne. And my area of expertise, as well as said, is about oppressed minorities. So my whole career has been spent on learning and understanding and investigating how oppressed minorities try to fight for recognition, how to fight for liberation, for visibility, to say the least, and how identities, there are attempts to hide or make identities disappear just because they don't happen to coincide with one's identity projection. So today I'm going to be quite brief. I'm going to touch upon the Lausanne Treaty and the question of self-determination of the Kurdish community. And Vicky gave a very good cue to me on that, in the sense that self-determination and democracy in respect of human rights should be in one package, because self-determination is a human right by definition. So you cannot use a human right in order to generate an oppressive regime. Something that has happened from Lausanne onwards, not only in that context, but I can assure you it has happened in several different geographical contexts. But in order to understand Lausanne, we need to go back to Sèvres, to the Treaty of Sèvres. And in fact, just a step before Sèvres, we need to go back to Woodrow Wilson and his 14th points speech, right at the end of the First World War. The 14 points was the United States and Wilson's wisdom of the new global architecture, how the world should look like right after the end of the First World War. And right there, in point 12 out of 14, Wilson, in his speech in Versailles, suggested that the Turkish portion of the present Ottoman Empire, the great patient of the time, and the question is what we're going to do with the Ottoman Empire. So
The Turkish portion should be assured a secure sovereignty, but other nationalities, which are now under Ottoman rule, should be assured an undoubted security of life and an unmolested opportunity of autonomous development. So Wilson opened the way to self-determination for the Kurdish and other communities within the Ottoman Empire, and for the Austro-Hungarian Empire as well, that was collapsing too from the war. Now, for Wilson, however, and I need to underline that because this will pop up later, for Wilson, self-determination was strictly and directly linked to democratic governance. So he was coming from the American system, from this American liberal democratic background. And for him to have a self-determining community, you need to have democratic governance. These two were interconnected in his mind. But only in his mind, however, as it turned out. So this Wilsonian vision was reflected to the Treaty of Sèvres, which was the first attempt to resolve the Ottoman question and to have to determine borders and the future of the minorities in there. So in Articles 62 and 64 of the treaty, it is quite clear, as you can read, that there is a clear pathway for self-determination, either in the form of autonomy or in the form of independent statehood, pending on a potential, probably plebiscite by the Kurdish population. The problem, however, is that Sèvres, as a treaty altogether, because it covered a number of different issues, it proved, as a French diplomat described it quite accurately, as fragile as the Sèvres porcelains. It was a stillborn treaty, basically, because there were so many conflicting interests and the need to address hard political questions on the ground that made Sèvres inoperable. What is, however, very important for me, and I want to underline here, is the way that the Western powers try to make sense of the communities within the Ottoman Empire. So in order to talk about self-determination, they assumed that these communities, not only the Kurds, the Armenians and others, had to present themselves as nations. Why this is problematic? Because the term nation in itself is a Western construct. It doesn't necessarily correspond, it didn't necessarily correspond to the realities on the ground during the Ottoman Empire for the communities there. It was a fiction. Nevertheless, it was very useful as a concept for them, for the Western power, because it was the only way for them to make sense of the situation. Therefore, they made the link that, okay, you want to claim self-determination, that's fine, I'm ready to go with it, so long as you are a nation, because for us, self-determination is designed for nations. It's national self-determination, which imposed on the Kurdish community a huge, massive burden. They had to transform overnight and enter into a race to prove their existence according to rules imposed by them by the Western world. And of course, it didn't happen because of the Kurdish society was so diverse, so multi-centered, with admittedly opposing interests in some areas, that to ask that it was a massive task, a huge task, an impossible task, to be honest. Sometimes in the literature, we come across that as the failure or the late awakening of Kurdish nationalism. For me, altogether, that is an imperial imposition. Because what we ask from communities, not only for the Kurds, but other communities outside the Western is to wear a Western suit in order to justify their existence and the right to govern themselves. And that was one major problem at Sèvres. Another, of course, major issue, as you're fully aware of, all of it, is the fact that on the ground, on the battlefield, Turkey, already since 1932, was gaining pace. And it was advancing. So Turkish nationalists under Kemal Atatürk, on the ground, they had effective control of more and more territory. And when you have effective control of the territory, you have the first word. You rule. You decide. Nobody can impose. And of course, also the allies have to think about the grand geopolitical landscape. Soviet Union, brand new after the revolution, was trying to expand southwards. The Turks were trying to explore that. So you know the story. And they have to think how they are going to maintain their control, the Russian allies in the region, and how to compare a brand new Soviet Union coming south. So all these were the challenges of Severus, and the allies were quite quick to revise it. The result was the Treaty of Lausanne,